This is a story called The Monkey's Paw from a writer by the name of W. Jacobs, written quite a long time ago. Are you feeling lucky tonight? There was a family who lived in a village in the north of England. It was quite an isolated village, far off the beaten track. Didn't have a lot of visitors. It was Mr. White and his wife and his son Herbert. Herbert was probably in his 30s, and he lived at home and went to work each day, but spent a lot of time with his parents. And this particular night, he was playing chess with his father. And they were expecting company, but they weren't sure their guests would arrive because of the weather. But then there was a knock on the door, and Mr. White, who was losing badly at the chess, said to his son, "Oh, it's Sergeant Major Morris. He's made it after all." And he went to the door and welcomed his old friend, and Sergeant Major Morris came in and sat down in the living room, and Mrs. White poured him a tumbler of whiskey, and he warmed himself by the fire. And the family sat and waited, for they knew he would have some good stories to tell. For Sergeant Major Morris had been living in India and other countries for a long time, and he told them many stories and adventures. And Mr. White said, "I'd really like to visit India sometime. It sounds so interesting." "Best you stay at home," said Sergeant Major Morris. And then Mr. White said, "Why don't you tell us the story about the monkey's paw?" "Yes," said Mrs. White, that sounds quite interesting." Morris reached into his pocket and brought a withered object. It was a monkey's paw. And he put it on the table and said, "Yes, that thing is the monkey's paw. A fakir, a holy man. He put a curse on it. He wanted to show people that you could not mess with fate, or there would be dire consequences. And he put a curse on it so that there would be 3 owners would each have 3 wishes granted." "What's so bad about that?" said Herbert. What's the matter with wishes?" "Wishes are not always what you would want them to be," said Morris. Did you make 3 wishes?" asked Herbert. "Yes, I did," said Morris. "And were they answered?" "Yes," Morris said. "And did anyone else have the paw before you?" "Yes, there was a previous owner. I don't know what his first 2 wishes were," said Morris, "but his last wish was for death. And that's how the paw came into my possession." "I don't understand," said Mr. White. "Why do you hold on to it if you've already had your 3 wishes? And the other wishes have been gone too. Why don't you give it away or sell it?" "I've thought about selling it," said Morris, "and people think it's a fairy tale. Some people say that, yeah, they'll buy it if I let them have a first wish. But really, I don't know why I keep it. It's really a wicked thing." And then Morris threw it into the fireplace. "No," said Mr. White, and he plunged his hand into the hot coals and pulled it out. "Ah, you've had your 3 wishes. There's still 3 wishes left," he said. "Best throw it back into the fireplace," said Morris. "How do you do it?" said Mr. White. "If you make your wishes, how do you do it?" "You hold it into your right hand and you make the wishes. But like I said, best throw it back into the fire." Well, the night was getting late. The family talked about some other things, and it came time for Morris to leave because he had to catch a train back to the city. At the door, he again implored Mr. White to throw it away. Mr. White just chuckled. Then, after Morris had left, Mr. and Mrs. White and Herbert sat round the fire. And Herbert said, "I don't see what could be so bad about 3 wishes. Father, why don't you wish that you were a king? Then you won't be henpecked anymore." And Mrs. White gave her son Herbert a stern look. "Well," said Mr. White, "I have all the things I really want. I've got a loving family. I like where I live. I've got more than many kings have." "Well, why don't you wish for... how much do we owe on the mortgage?" asked Herbert. "Isn't it £200? Why don't you wish for £200? "Oh," said Mr. White, "I suppose." And he picked up the monkey's paw into his right hand and said, "I wish for £200. Ooh! He dropped it. "What's the matter?" asked Herbert and Mrs. White. "It moved like a snake," said Mr. White. "Well," said Herbert, "I wonder how the wish is going to hurt us. I suppose a bag of money could fall from the sky and land on our heads. Or maybe when you go to bed tonight, it'll be sitting on your bed." Well, there was no bag of money on their bed that night. And in the morning, when the family got up, the sun was shining and everything looked quite different. And Mr. White said, I don't know why I was so scared last night." And Herbert, before he went to work at the factory in the city, said, "Father, if the money comes while I'm gone, don't spend it all. I want to make sure I get some of it too." And then he headed down the walk to catch the train to his work. Well, the family, Mr. and Mrs. White, they watched the door to see if somebody would arrive with some money. There was a knock on the door at one point. It was the mailman. He had some bills. Mrs. White looked at them and said, "Herbert will laugh when he sees this. No money, just more debt that we owe." Well, about midday, Mrs. White looked out the window and said, "There's a strange man out there. He's been walking back and forth and in front of our fence and stopping, and now he's coming up the walk." There was a well-dressed young man. He came up the walk and knocked on the front door. Mrs. White opened it. "Mr. and Mrs. White?" said the man. He was quite well-dressed. "Yes," said Mrs. White. "I'm from Ma and Megan's," the young man said. Mr. and Mrs. White recognized the name right away. It was the factory where Herbert worked. "What is it?" said Mrs. White. "Is there bad news?" "Don't jump to any conclusions," said Mr. White. "Let him come in." The young man came in. He was silent for a moment, and then he said, "There's been a terrible accident. Your son, Herbert, he fell into the machinery. He was terribly hurt, but he's not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said Mrs. White, and then she realized the sinister meaning of the words, and her face turned white and she began to cry. The man continued, "Ma and Megan's want to know that they feel so terribly badly about what happened to your son, but they are not responsible for it, but they want to compensate you for your loss. So I've brought some money, a check from Ma and Megan's." "How much is it?" asked Mr. White. £200, said the young man. Mr. and Mrs. White buried their son Herbert a few days later in the cemetery about 2 miles away from their house. They came back to the house and they didn't talk much. The house was filled with sadness. They had little to talk about. The days passed by. Not many words exchanged between the two of them. One night, Mr. White woke up and heard his wife standing by the window crying. "Come back to bed," he said. "It's cold." "It's colder for Herbert," she said. And then she looked at her husband and said, "The monkey's paw. You didn't throw it away, did you?" "No," said Mr. White. "It's still in the drawer downstairs." "Why?" There's still 2 wishes left on it. We can wish for Herbert back. We can wish to have our son back." "Oh," said Mr. White, "that would be a wicked thing to do. I didn't tell you when I went to see his body. The only way I could recognize him because of the accident was the clothing he was wearing. We can't bring him back." "You don't want your son back? Go and get me the paw," said Mrs. White. Mr. White was afraid of his wife. He went downstairs and brought the paw upstairs and held it in his right hand. "Make the wish. Ask for Herbert back again," she asked. I want our son to be alive again, said Mr. White. Ah! And he dropped the paw on the floor. The two of them stood by the window looking out into the night. The wind was howling. Nobody showed up. Sighed Mr. White in relief, and he climbed into bed, and a short time later his wife joined him. Mr. White was a lighter sleeper than his wife. Suddenly he woke up. He heard a noise downstairs. What is it, he wondered. He grabbed the lantern and walked down the stairs to the bottom of the stairs. It was clearly the sound of a knuckle on wood. He was filled with terror. Oh, he thought, perhaps it will go away. He went upstairs, climbed into bed, and hoped that his wife would not hear, but a short time later she woke up. What's that sound? She said. Nothing, said her husband. It's just the gate blowing in the wind. No, she said. It's Herbert. Herbert's come back. I forgot that the cemetery was 2 miles away. Herbert, I am coming, she cried. He tried to hold on to his wife, but she broke away from him and ran down the stairs. Herbert, she said. The knocking continued, grew louder and louder. Don't let it in, he cried. Are you afraid of your own son? Cried Mrs. White, looking up the stairs. And she slid the bottom bolt free. And then she said, come downstairs, help me with the upper bolt. It's high, it's hard to reach. And then Mr. White heard the sound of a chair being pulled against the door, and his wife climbing up on the chair, and he was scrambling on the floor looking for the monkey's paw. And the knocking continued, louder and insistent. And then he heard the top bolt being slid free. And just at that moment, he found the paw and he breathed the last wish. And the knocking stopped. And he heard the bolt being pulled free. And he heard his wife pull the chair away and open the door. And then Mr. White heard the howl of the wind coming through the door and the howl of anguish from his wife. And he ran down to join her at the bottom of the stairs, and he looked out into the night. And the street light shone on the empty walk with the gate open and flapping in the wind. The monkey's paw. Be careful what you wish for.